On July 13, 1870, Otto von Bismarck sat at his desk in Berlin, holding a simple telegram from his king. He dramatically abridged the message, deleting conciliatory language and sharpening its tone to transform diplomatic courtesy into calculated insult. Within days, two great nations would be marching toward a war that would reshape Europe forever. This is the true story of how a diplomatic message became a declaration of war and how a master manipulator used the newest technology of his age to ignite the very conflict he desired. Good evening and welcome to the archive. I have a particularly instructive file for you tonight, a specimen from our collection on diplomatic catastrophes. Here, in these yellowed folders, we preserve the evidence of how civilized nations can stumble into war through pride, manipulation, and the dangerous acceleration of communication itself. If you find a strange comfort in these quiet explorations of human folly, feel free to subscribe. It ensures you'll be notified when a new exhibit is opened from our vast collection. Now let us open the case file on what historians have come to call the Eames Dispatch, a telegram that was never meant to start a war, until a brilliant and ruthless mind decided that it should. Case File 1, The Grand Delusion, the Fever of Nationalism. Let us begin our examination in the summer of 1870, when Europe simmered with a particular kind of madness that our forebears called national honor, that peculiar delusion that a nation's worth could be measured in the deference paid to its flag and the fear inspired by its armies. Picture, if you will, two great powers eyeing each other across the Rhine like prize fighters circling in a ring. On one side, the Second French Empire of Napoleon, the third nephew to the great Bonaparte, though lacking his uncle's genius for war. The French had grown drunk on their own mythology. They remembered their glorious past when French armies had marched from Madrid to Moscow, when the very mention of French steel had made emperors tremble. Never mind that those days were decades past. Never mind that their army had grown soft with imperial comfort. In the cafes of Paris and the drawing rooms of the Tuileries, there was talk of teaching these upstart Prussians their proper place. On the eastern bank of that ancient river, Prussia had awakened from centuries of being Europe's convenient battlefield. Under the iron discipline of their military tradition and the cold calculation of their new chancellor, they had begun to dream not merely of survival, but of supremacy. The Prussian eagle was spreading its wings, and German nationalism, that most dangerous of 19th century innovations, was stirring in the hearts of millions who had never before thought of themselves as one people. Here, in our archives, we possess the newspapers of that fevered summer. Turn their brittle pages with care, and you will find the evidence of a continent that had convinced itself that war was not only inevitable, but desirable. The French press spoke of the need to humble Prussian arrogance. The German papers wrote of the decadent French threat to German honor. Both populations had worked themselves into that peculiar state of mind where dying for an abstract principle seemed not only reasonable, but noble. This was the age of romantic nationalism, when peoples across Europe had convinced themselves that their particular tribe was blessed by Providence with some special mission. The French believed themselves the inheritors of revolutionary liberty and imperial glory. The Germans had begun to dream of their destiny as the new Rome of the North. Both had forgotten the elementary truth that pride, as the ancient Greeks knew well, is the prelude to catastrophe. The delusion was made more potent by memory. The French remembered their victories at Austerlitz and Jena, when their armies had carved through European coalitions like a sword through silk. They had forgotten Waterloo, Leipzig, and the bitter lessons of overextension. The Prussians remembered their humiliation during the Napoleonic Wars, when French soldiers had paraded through Berlin and their king had been reduced to a French client. They had not forgotten, but they had learned. While the French had grown comfortable in their assumed superiority, the Prussians had been building the most efficient military machine Europe had ever seen. In the salons of Paris, military men spoke confidently of their army's experience gained in the Crimean War and their recent adventures in Mexico. What they did not speak of, what they perhaps did not wish to acknowledge, was that these had been expeditions against enemies who fought with tactics a generation out of date. They had not faced the needle gun, that Prussian innovation that could be loaded from the breech and fired with deadly precision. They had not encountered the methodical staff work that had allowed Prussia to mobilize and move armies with the efficiency of a railroad timetable. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the delusion that war could be brief and glorious. This was still the age when men believed that modern conflicts would be decided by a single decisive battle, that superior elan could overcome superior preparation, that honor mattered more than logistics. The bitter lessons of the American Civil War, that modern weapons made warfare a grinding, industrial process of attrition, had been dismissed as the crude improvisations of amateur soldiers fighting in a distant wilderness. And so, as the summer of 1870 deepened, two great nations convinced themselves that they were ready for a war that both sides believed they could win quickly and cleanly. The French trusted in their martial tradition and their assumption of natural superiority. The Prussians trusted in their preparation and their burning desire to prove themselves worthy of the German nation they dreamed of creating. Neither side understood that they were about to demonstrate one of history's most reliable principles, that the outcome of wars is determined not by the righteousness of one's cause or the fervor of one's patriotism, but by the unglamorous realities of organization, equipment, and planning. The French would discover that their beautiful uniforms and stirring marching songs were poor protection against rifled artillery and superior numbers. The Prussians would learn that their magnificent victory would plant the seeds of a century of European catastrophe. But all of this lay in the future. In July of 1870, all that was needed was a spark to ignite this carefully prepared bonfire of national vanity. That spark would come in the form of a diplomatic telegram, and the man who would strike it was already waiting, quill pen in hand, in his study in Berlin. Case File 2. The Iron Chancellor's Masterpiece. Let us now move from the grand hall of national delusions to a more intimate chamber in our archive, the study of personal ambition. Here, filed under the name Bismarck, we encounter one of history's most calculating minds, a man who understood that the art of statecraft often requires the deliberate cultivation of one's enemy's worst impulses. Otto von Bismarck was not a man given to romantic notions about war or honor. While his contemporaries spoke in stirring phrases about national destiny, he thought in terms of railway timetables and military budgets. While they dreamed of glorious charges and stirring victories, he calculated the precise number of divisions required to achieve his political objectives. He was, in the truest sense, a political engineer, a man who could look at the machinery of state and see exactly which lever needed to be pulled to produce the desired result. By the summer of 1870, Bismarck had already demonstrated his mastery of this dark art twice. He had maneuvered Austria into a war in 1866 that had ejected them from German affairs forever. He had orchestrated the political isolation that made this victory possible. Now he faced his final and most dangerous opponent, France, whose very existence as a great power seemed to block the path to German unification. But Bismarck was patient. He understood that the aggressor in any European war would face a coalition of enemies, while the victim could count on at least the neutrality, if not the support, of the other powers. He needed France to strike the first blow. He needed them to appear as the aggressor. He needed them to do exactly what their national character and political situation made them most likely to do: act on impulse, in anger, without proper calculation of the consequences. The opportunity came from an unlikely source, the throne of Spain. That troubled kingdom had been without a monarch since 1868, when Queen Isabella II had been driven into exile by revolution. After much deliberation, The Spanish Cortes had offered the crown to Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a distant relative of the Prussian king. It was a purely dynastic arrangement, the sort of royal musical chairs that had been common in Europe for centuries. But Bismarck saw something more. He saw a pressure point that, if pressed correctly, would cause the French to react with exactly the sort of righteous indignation that would justify the war he desired. A Hohenzollern on the Spanish throne would mean German princes to the north and south of France, an encirclement that French pride could never tolerate. It would be 1870's version of Charles V's ring of Habsburg territories that had once threatened to strangle France in its cradle. The beauty of Bismarck's scheme lay in its apparent innocence. Prussia was not placing Leopold on the Spanish throne. The Spanish themselves had chosen him. Prussia was merely allowing a German prince to accept the honor freely offered to him. If France chose to see this as a threat, if they chose to respond with threats and ultimatums, well, that would reveal the true nature of French aggression, would it not? When news of Leopold's candidacy broke in Paris, the reaction was exactly what Bismarck had calculated. The French press exploded in outrage. The Chamber of Deputies echoed with speeches about German encirclement and threats to French security. Napoleon III's government, already weakened by internal opposition and looking for a victory to restore their prestige, saw an opportunity to humble Prussia and remind Europe of French power. The French response was swift and, from their perspective, reasonable. Their ambassador, Count Benedetti, was dispatched to the Prussian king Wilhelm I, who was taking the waters at the fashionable spa town of Ems. The ambassador's instructions were clear. Demand that Leopold withdraw his candidacy, and that the king promise such candidacies would not be renewed in the future. But here, Bismarck faced a problem. King Wilhelm, unlike his chancellor, was a gentleman of the old school. When Benedetti approached him during his morning walk in the park at Ems, the king listened politely to the French demands. More troubling still, Leopold himself, under family pressure and perhaps sensing the diplomatic storm he had created, chose to withdraw his candidacy voluntarily. A crisis appeared to be resolving itself peacefully, precisely what Bismarck did not want. But the French government, intoxicated by this apparent victory, committed the fatal error of overreach. Not content with Leopold's withdrawal, they instructed Benedetti to approach the king again, this time demanding that Wilhelm provide a formal guarantee that no Hohenzollern prince would ever again accept the Spanish throne. It was this demand reasonable from the French perspective, but deeply insulting to Prussian dignity, that would give Bismarck the opening he needed. On the morning of July 13, 1870, a telegram arrived at Bismarck's residence in Berlin. It was from Heinrich Abekin, a counselor in the Prussian Foreign Ministry, who was attending the king at Ems. The telegram was a straightforward diplomatic report, describing how the king had politely but firmly declined to provide the guarantee the French demanded, and how he had instructed his aide-de-camp to inform the French ambassador that he had nothing further to add to the subject. Bismarck read the telegram carefully. Then he read it again. Here, in these mundane bureaucratic sentences, lay the key to everything he had been working toward. The telegram was perfectly accurate, perfectly proper, and perfectly useless for his purposes. As written, it made the king appear reasonable and the French demands appear excessive, but it did not provide the spark needed to ignite the fire of war. What happened next has been preserved for us in Bismarck's own memoirs, though we must read his account with the knowledge that it was written by a man justifying his actions to history. According to the Iron Chancellor, he was dining that evening with General Helmuth von Moltke, the chief of the Prussian General Staff, and General Albrecht von Roon, the war minister. Both military men were confident of victory if war came, but both were concerned about the diplomatic situation. If France appeared as the injured party, other European powers might intervene on their behalf. Bismarck showed them the Ems telegram. Then, through what he described as careful editing, he dramatically abridged the message. He removed the polite language that made the king's refusal sound courteous and reasonable. He condensed the account so that it appeared the king had curtly dismissed the French ambassador without ceremony. Most crucially, he transformed the overall tone from diplomatic courtesy to calculated insult. The edited version suggested that the king had refused to receive the French ambassador at all, and that he had authorized the publication of this snub. Where the original telegram described a polite conversation between gentlemen, the edited version described a public humiliation. Where the original left room for further diplomatic negotiation, the edited version slammed the door shut with unmistakable finality. Bismarck then did something that revealed his true genius for manipulation. He immediately released the edited telegram to the press. Within hours, the story was racing across Europe via the new telegraph networks. In Paris, the edited version read like a deliberate slap in the face. In Berlin, it appeared that the king had finally shown proper firmness in dealing with French arrogance. The reaction was instantaneous and exactly what Bismarck had calculated. In Paris, crowds gathered in the streets shouting, "A Berlin!" The French government, which had been looking for a graceful way to back down from their excessive demands, suddenly found themselves facing a public that demanded satisfaction for this intolerable insult. Within days, France had declared war on Prussia, appearing to all of Europe as the aggressor in an unprovoked conflict. What makes this manipulation so instructive for our archive is not merely its cleverness, but its revelation of how a master manipulator works. Bismarck did not invent the crisis. He merely saw the potential in a situation that already existed. He did not force the French to make excessive demands. He simply waited for their pride to lead them in that direction. He did not create the technology that would spread his edited message across Europe in hours. He simply understood how to use that technology for his purposes. Most importantly, he understood that the most effective lies are those that contain just enough truth to be believable. The Ems dispatch, as edited by Bismarck, was not a complete fabrication. The king had indeed refused the French demands. The conversation with Benedetti had indeed taken place. The ambassador had indeed been told there was nothing more to discuss. Every fact in the edited version was technically accurate. It was only the context and tone that had been deliberately distorted. In this, we see a pattern that would be repeated throughout the decades to come: the use of mass communication to manufacture consent for predetermined policies. Bismarck had discovered that in an age of rapid communication and mass literacy, public opinion could be shaped as deliberately as clay in a potter's hands. The art lay not in telling people what to think, but in presenting information in such a way that they would inevitably reach the conclusions you desired. And so, through the masterful manipulation of a single diplomatic telegram, Otto von Bismarck achieved in days what might have taken years of conventional diplomacy. He had maneuvered France into the position of aggressor. He had united German public opinion behind Prussia. He had ensured that other European powers would remain neutral in the coming conflict. All that remained was to demonstrate that his armies were as efficient as his diplomacy. But as we shall see in our next specimen, even the Iron Chancellor could not have foreseen how the very technology he had used so brilliantly to start his war would transform the nature of warfare itself. Case File 3. The Technological Blunder. The telegraph's unforgiving speed. Let us now venture into a different wing of our archive, where we preserve the specimens of humanity's peculiar relationship with its own innovations. Here, among the exhibits of technological hubris, we find one of the 19th century's most transformative inventions, the electric telegraph, and how it fundamentally altered the ancient rhythm of diplomacy, often in ways its creators never intended. To understand the magnitude of this change, we must first appreciate what diplomacy had been for millennia before Samuel. Morse sent his first message tapping across copper wires. Picture, if you will, the stately dance of international relations as it had existed since the time of the pharaohs. Ambassadors traveled for weeks or months to reach foreign courts. Messages crossed continents at the speed of a galloping horse or a sailing ship battling contrary winds. This glacial pace was not merely an inconvenience. It was a feature, not a bug, in the delicate machinery of statcraft. Consider how this natural delay served as a buffer against the worst impulses of human nature. When an insult was given in Vienna, it might be weeks before word reached Paris, and weeks more before any response could arrive back in Austria. During this interval, tempers could cool. Advisors could counsel restraint. Second thoughts could emerge. The very slowness of communication forced reflection, compromise, and the careful weighing of consequences. Diplomacy moved at the speed of human wisdom, not human passion. But by 1870, this ancient rhythm had been shattered forever. The telegraph networks that now spanned Europe could carry a message from Berlin to Paris in a matter of hours. What had once taken weeks now happened in the time it took to brew a pot of tea. The implications of this acceleration were profound, though few at the time fully grasped what they had unleashed upon the world. The electric telegraph was, in many ways, the Internet of the 19th century, a revolutionary communication technology that promised to unite humanity in an unprecedented exchange of information and ideas. Many of its advocates spoke in terms that would sound familiar to our modern ears. The telegraph would bring nations closer together, eliminate misunderstandings, and perhaps even make war less likely through the simple expedient of instant communication. The reasoning seemed logical enough. Surely conflicts arose from ignorance and delay. Remove these barriers, and peace might naturally follow. They could not have been more wrong. What the telegraph actually did was remove the natural cooling-off periods that had traditionally prevented minor diplomatic incidents from escalating into major international crises. It eliminated the space for reflection that had allowed cooler heads to prevail. Most dangerously of all, it placed enormous power in the hands of whoever controlled the flow of information, as Otto von Bismarck was about to demonstrate with devastating effectiveness. The telegraph networks of 1870 were not the democratizing force their inventors had envisioned. They were centralized systems, controlled by governments and large commercial interests. In Prussia, all telegraph traffic was routed through Berlin, where it could be monitored, edited, or delayed as the authorities saw fit. This centralization meant that a man like Bismarck could not only control what messages his government sent, but could also influence the speed and manner of their distribution. When Bismarck received the original Mies telegram on the afternoon of July 13th, he was acutely aware that he possessed not just information, but timing. The original message from Abakan had been sent via the normal diplomatic channels, which meant it would remain confidential until the foreign ministry chose to release it. But Bismarck understood that in the new age of telegraphic communication, the first version of a story to reach the public would likely become the accepted truth, regardless of later corrections or clarifications. This is why Bismarck's editing of the telegram was only half of his masterstroke. The other half was his decision to release it immediately to the press agencies. By 1870, news organizations had developed their own telegraph networks, parallel to the diplomatic and commercial systems. A story released in Berlin in the evening could appear in Paris newspapers the following morning, and from there spread across Europe within days. Bismarck sent his edited version of the Ems dispatch simultaneously to the Prussian embassies across Europe and to the press. A message reached the French public, not through careful diplomatic channels, where it might have been clarified or contextualized, but through the sensationalist lens of newspaper headlines. The French press, always eager for dramatic stories that would sell papers, presented the edited telegram in the most inflammatory terms possible. Here we encounter one of the telegraph's most insidious effects on human affairs: its tendency to strip away nuance and context in favor of speed and brevity. The original conversation between King Wilhelm and Count Benedetti had been a complex diplomatic exchange, full of subtle gradations of meaning, polite evasions, and face-saving formulas. But telegraph transmissions were expensive. Every word cost money. The technology itself encouraged compression, simplification, and the reduction of complex realities to their most basic elements. This compression was not merely technical. It was psychological. Newspapers, suddenly able to receive news from across the continent within hours, found themselves competing not just for accuracy, but for speed. The first paper to publish a story gained a crucial advantage over its rivals. This pressure encouraged editors to publish first and verify later, to choose the most dramatic interpretation of events, and to present complex diplomatic maneuvers as simple conflicts between good and evil. The French newspapers that published Bismarck's version of the Ems telegram on the morning of July 14th did not present it as a diplomatic communication that might be subject to interpretation or clarification. They presented it as established fact. The King of Prussia had publicly snubbed the French ambassador, had refused to guarantee that German princes would stay off the Spanish throne, and had authorized the release of this information as a deliberate insult to French honor. The speed of telegraphic communication meant that by the time more measured voices might have pointed out the ambiguities in the dispatch, the narrative had already crystallized in the public mind. The French government, which might have had time to seek clarification through normal diplomatic channels, instead found itself facing newspaper headlines and street demonstrations demanding immediate action. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this technological acceleration was how it interacted with the democratic reforms that had been sweeping across Europe throughout the 19th century. In earlier eras, decisions about war and peace had been made by small circles of aristocrats and professional diplomats who understood the delicate mechanics of international relations. By 1870, however, both France and Prussia had developed something approaching mass politics. Public opinion, as expressed in newspapers and demonstrations, had become a factor that no government could ignore. The telegraph had created a situation where public opinion could be mobilized faster than diplomatic wisdom could be applied. The masses, reading inflammatory headlines based on compressed and edited information, could demand action before their governments had time to fully understand what was actually happening. In France, the government of Napoleon III found itself trapped between the Prussian insult, as presented by the newspapers, and the public demand for satisfaction, as amplified by those same newspapers. This was the birth of what we might call telegraph diplomacy, the conducting of international relations at the speed of mass communication rather than the speed of careful reflection. It was a fundamentally different kind of statcraft, one that rewarded quick reactions over measured responses, dramatic gestures over subtle negotiations, and public posturing over private accommodation. The irony is particularly bitter when we consider that the telegraph had been invented with the noblest intentions. Samuel Morse himself had believed that instant communication would bring about an era of international understanding. The ability to exchange messages rapidly across vast distances would, he thought, eliminate the misunderstandings that led to conflict. Instead, as the Ems dispatch demonstrated, the telegraph had created new opportunities for misunderstanding and had given master manipulators like Bismarck unprecedented power to shape public opinion across entire continents. The technology had also created what we might recognize as an early version of the modern news cycle. Information moved so quickly that there was no time for verification, no space for second thoughts, and no opportunity for the kind of patient diplomacy that had traditionally prevented minor incidents from becoming major crises. The telegraph had compressed the decision-making timeline from weeks or months to hours or days, and human institutions had not yet adapted to this new reality. By the evening of July 14, 1870, exactly 24 hours after Bismarck had edited the original Ems telegram, the French government was facing demonstrations in the streets of Paris demanding war with Prussia. The technology that was supposed to bring nations together had instead provided the perfect mechanism for driving them apart. The speed that was supposed to prevent misunderstandings had instead made Case File 4, the hindsight file, seeds of a century's catastrophe. And so we arrive at the final chamber of our exhibit, where we preserve the specimens of consequence. Those moments when the full weight of human folly reveals itself not in years, but in decades and generations. Here, filed under unintended consequences, we find the true cost of Bismarck's brilliant manipulation. Not merely a war, but the architecture of a century's worth of European catastrophe. The Franco-Prussian War that erupted from Bismarck's edited telegram lasted less than a year, but its effects would echo through the corridors of European politics for the next 75 years. It was, in retrospect, not an ending but a beginning, the first movement in a symphony of destruction that would not reach its crescendo until the smoking ruins of Berlin in 1945. Let us examine first the immediate consequences of that manufactured crisis. Within weeks of the war's outbreak, it became clear that French confidence had been as inflated as their rhetoric. The Prussian military machine that Bismarck had spent decades building proved devastatingly effective. At Sedan, on September 2, 1870, Napoleon III himself was captured along with an entire French army. The Second Empire collapsed within days, swept away by a catastrophe that few had thought possible. But Bismarck's true masterstroke was not military, it was political. The German states, faced with what appeared to be unprovoked French aggression, rallied to Prussia's banner with an enthusiasm that years of diplomatic pressure had never achieved. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, all the southern German kingdoms that had resisted Prussian dominance suddenly found themselves eager to join a German confederation under Prussian leadership. The war that had begun with a doctored telegram ended with the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, with Wilhelm I crowned as Kaiser and Bismarck as his Iron Chancellor. It seemed, from Bismarck's perspective, a perfect success. Through careful manipulation and superior preparation, he had achieved in months what might have taken decades through conventional diplomacy. France had been humbled, Germany had been united, and Prussia had emerged as the dominant power in Central Europe. The aging diplomat might have been forgiven for believing that he had authored a masterpiece of statecraft. But here, in the deeper folders of our archive, we find the documents that reveal the true cost of this apparent triumph. The treaty that ended the Franco-Prussian War included provisions that would poison European politics for generations. France was required to pay an enormous indemnity, 5 billion francs, roughly equivalent to France's entire annual budget. More devastatingly still, France was forced to cede the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to the new German Empire. Bismarck himself had opposed the annexation of these territories, understanding with his characteristic shrewdness that it would create a permanent enemy on Germany's western border. But he was overruled by his generals and by public opinion, both drunk on victory and convinced that German-speaking Alsace-Lorraine rightfully belonged to the new German nation. It was one of the few times in his career that Bismarck allowed emotion to override calculation, and it would prove to be a fatal error. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine created in France what the French called the revanche, the desire for revenge, for the recovery of the lost provinces, for the restoration of French honor. Every French schoolchild would grow up staring at maps that showed the lost territories in black, mourning for provinces they had never seen. French foreign policy for the next 44 years would be oriented around a single goal: the recovery of Alsace-Lorraine and revenge against Germany. But the consequences extended far beyond French resentment. Bismarck's success in using the telegraph to manufacture a casus belli had demonstrated to every government in Europe the power of information manipulation in an age of mass communication. The lesson was quickly learned and applied. Governments began to invest heavily in press control, in propaganda agencies, and in the dark arts of public opinion management. The Franco-Prussian War also revealed the true nature of warfare in the industrial age. This was not the brief, decisive conflict that both sides had expected, but a grinding demonstration of how modern weapons and transportation networks had transformed the character of military operations. The Prussian victory owed less to superior courage or tactical brilliance than to superior organization, better communications, and more efficient mobilization systems. These lessons were carefully studied by military establishments across Europe. The result was an arms race that would consume increasing portions of national budgets and create military establishments with vested interests in testing their expensive new weapons and elaborate mobilization plans. By 1914, Europe had become an armed camp, with every major power maintaining military forces far larger than any conceivable defensive need could justify. Perhaps most tragically, Bismarck's success in manipulating the crisis of 1870 had demonstrated that wars could be manufactured through careful management of information and public opinion. This lesson would be remembered and applied by far less skillful practitioners of the art. The techniques that Bismarck had used with surgical precision would be employed by lesser men with cruder instruments and more destructive results. The alliance system that emerged from the Franco-Prussian War was itself a direct consequence of Bismarck's masterpiece. France, isolated and humiliated, began the patient work of building coalitions against German power. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain in 1904, and finally the Triple Entente that would face Germany in 1914, all of these can be traced back to the resentments created by the Ems dispatch and its aftermath. Bismarck himself, with characteristic prescience, understood what he had unleashed. In his final years, after being dismissed by Wilhelm II in 1890, he warned repeatedly that another European war was inevitable, and that Germany would find itself surrounded by enemies seeking revenge for 1870. When asked to predict when this war might come, he replied with grim accuracy, 20 years after my death. He died in 1898. The Great War began in 1914, but even Bismarck could not have foreseen the full magnitude of the catastrophe his diplomatic masterstroke had set in motion. The techniques of information manipulation that he had pioneered would be refined and systematized by later practitioners. The nationalism that he had so skillfully exploited would mutate into more virulent and destructive forms. The military-industrial complex that his wars had created would develop its own momentum, independent of rational political control. The telegraph networks that had carried his edited dispatch across Europe in 1870 would evolve into the mass media systems that would carry far more destructive messages in the decades to come. The same technologies that had allowed Bismarck to manipulate public opinion with surgical precision would later be used to manufacture consent for wars of unprecedented destructiveness and ideological virulence. In the deeper archives, we preserve the casualty figures that tell the true story of what Bismarck's success had cost Europe. The Franco-Prussian War itself claimed roughly 180,000 lives, a significant number, but modest compared to what was to come. World War I, the conflict that emerged directly from the alliance system and national resentments, created in 1870, would consume over 16 million lives. World War II, fought largely over the unresolved issues left by the Great War, would claim over 70 million. Between these two great conflicts lay a landscape of revolutions, civil wars, genocides, and economic catastrophes, all traceable in part to the fault lines created by Bismarck's diplomatic engineering. The Russian Revolution, the collapse of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, the rise of fascism and communism all were, in varying degrees, consequences of the European order that emerged from the Franco-Prussian War. Even the Cold War that dominated the second half of the 20th century can be seen as the final act in the drama that began with the Ems dispatch. The division of Germany that lasted from 1945 to 1989 was, in a sense, the ultimate consequence of the German unification that Bismarck had achieved through his manipulation of that crucial telegram. The Berlin Wall that divided the German capital was perhaps the most visible symbol of how completely the European order that Bismarck had created had ultimately destroyed itself. And yet, in the final irony, Bismarck's techniques of information manipulation and public opinion management survived and prospered long after his political creation had crumbled to dust. The marriage of advanced communication technology and sophisticated propaganda that he had pioneered in 1870 would become the standard operating procedure for 20th century governments. From the radio broadcasts of the 1930s to the internet campaigns of our own era, the essential elements remain the same. The careful editing of information, the strategic timing of releases, and the exploitation of mass media to shape public opinion in service of predetermined political goals. In this sense, perhaps, Bismarck's true legacy lies not in the German Empire that lasted less than 50 years, but in the techniques of information warfare that have become the common currency of modern politics. Every government spokesman who carefully phrases a statement to create a particular impression, every news organization that chooses which facts to emphasize and which to omit, every political campaign that seeks to control the narrative through strategic leaks and calculated revelations, all are, in their way, disciples of the Iron Chancellor who discovered how to turn a diplomatic telegram into a declaration of war. The Ems dispatch teaches us that in an age of instant communication and mass politics, information is power in the most literal sense. Those who control the flow and framing of information can shape events with a precision that would have been impossible in earlier eras. But it also teaches us that this power comes with terrible responsibilities and even more terrible consequences for those who wield it carelessly or for purely selfish ends. Bismarck created the Germany he desired, but he also created the conditions that would eventually destroy it. He achieved his immediate political objectives, but at the cost of unleashing forces that would ultimately consume far more than he had ever hoped to gain. He demonstrated the power of information manipulation in the modern age, but also revealed its capacity for creating unintended consequences that could echo through generations. Reflection. And so we close the file on the Ems dispatch, that modest telegram that changed the course of European history. The document itself rests here in our collection, a few dozen words on yellowed paper, hardly different from thousands of other diplomatic communications that have survived from that era. Yet this particular specimen altered the destiny of nations and the lives of millions. In the end, perhaps the most instructive aspect of this entire episode is how perfectly it demonstrates the gap between cleverness and wisdom. Bismarck was undoubtedly one of the most brilliant political tacticians in European history. His manipulation of the Ems telegram was a masterpiece of strategic thinking, executed with precision and achieving its immediate objectives completely. And yet, the ultimate consequences of his success were precisely the opposite of what any rational German statesman would have desired. This is the peculiar tragedy of the clever man. He can see exactly how to achieve his immediate goals, but he cannot foresee the distant consequences of his success. Bismarck understood perfectly how to use nationalism, mass communication, and public opinion manipulation to create the Germany he envisioned. What he could not understand, what perhaps no one could have understood in 1870, was how these same forces, once unleashed, would develop their own logic and momentum, independent of the intentions of their original architects. The technologies and techniques that Bismarck pioneered in service of Prussian ambition would eventually be turned against his creation by others who had learned his lessons all too well. The nationalism he had so skillfully exploited would evolve into more virulent forms that would consume the Germany he had built. The mass media manipulation he had perfected would become the common tool of demagogues and dictators who would make his conservative authoritarianism seem benign by comparison. Perhaps this is why we preserve these specimens in our archive, not to condemn or celebrate the actors in these historical dramas, but to remind ourselves of the essential unpredictability of human affairs. Even the most brilliant minds operating with perfect information and unlimited resources, cannot fully control the consequences of their actions. The cleverer the scheme, it often seems, the more surprising and destructive its ultimate results. In our own age of instant global communication and sophisticated information manipulation, the lessons of the M's dispatch remain painfully relevant. We live in a world where a single tweet can reach millions of people in minutes, where carefully edited videos can shape public opinion across continents, where the strategic timing of information releases can topple governments and start wars. The technologies have evolved, but the essential dynamics remain unchanged. Those who control information can shape events, but they cannot control the ultimate consequences of their manipulation. The telegraph that carried Bismarck's edited dispatch across Europe in 1870 was, in its time, as revolutionary